Some places do not want to be remembered. Lake Aethel is one of them. A young folklorist named Alara discovered this truth when she found her grandfather's old journals, filled with frantic notes about the very same lake. The local residents refused to speak of the waters, their silence a wall of pure dread. Driven by a need to understand this enforced amnesia, Alara made a pivotal choice. She would travel to the mist-shrouded shores and investigate the unnerving quiet for herself. In doing so, she risked everything, her academic reputation and her very sanity, to uncover the truths that everyone else had chosen to forget. By the end of her journey, you will understand the chilling source of the voices beneath the lake and what happens when forgotten memories demand to be heard. What mysteries lie hidden in the waters near you right now as you listen to this story. Wherever you are in the world and whatever the hour, feel free to share your location and the local time in a comment. It is always fascinating to connect across the distances. Can a memory be so dangerous that it is better lost forever? The journey to Lake Aethel felt like traveling backward in time. The modern world frayed at the edges, the roads grew narrower, and the dense, ancient forest seemed to swallow all sound. Elara arrived on a shore, perpetually veiled in a low, clinging mist. The air was thick with the smell of wet earth and decay, and the water itself was a sheet of dull, leaden gray, unnaturally still. Her first act was to set up her audio equipment, placing sensitive microphones at the water's edge to capture the ambient silence she had read about. But the silence here was not an absence. It was a presence, a heavy blanket that seemed to push back against the very idea of sound. The few locals she managed to find, a reclusive farmer and an elderly woman who ran the lone general store, offered only terse, fearful warnings. Their eyes darted toward the lake as they spoke, their words carefully measured. Do not go out after dark. Do not listen to the water. Leave this place. Their suspicion was a physical wall, and Alara felt her own isolation deepen with every failed conversation. Even her initial recordings were wrong. When she played them back through her headphones, she heard the expected rustle of leaves and the distant call of a bird, but these sounds were punctuated by stretches of absolute dead air. And within those gaps, if she strained, she could just make them out. Whispers, not words, but the ghost of words, a sibilant rush just below the threshold of hearing. It was a sound that coiled in the pit of her stomach. Her grandfather's journals were no longer just academic notes. They were a warning she was now living. Fear became a constant companion, a cold knot in her chest that tightened every time she looked at the opaque water. The community's dread was contagious, and she began to question her own resolve. What if they were right? What if some things are better left forgotten? But to turn back now would be to admit that the silence had won. So she made a decision that defied every instinct for self-preservation. She would camp alone on the shore for the night. It was the only way to gather the evidence she needed to record the lake when it was most active. As the sun dipped below the tree line, the atmosphere shifted palpably. The water, which had been so still, began to show strange, concentric ripples that started from the center for no apparent reason. A low, resonant hum vibrated through the ground, a sensation felt more in the bones than heard with the ears. Her investigation was not just uncovering a mystery, it was disturbing it. As full darkness enveloped her small camp, the whispers in her headphones grew clearer, more insistent. They were no longer just background noise. They were becoming distinct. And in that moment, huddled by her feeble fire, Alara knew with a chilling certainty that she was not alone on that desolate shore. The whispers in her headphones sharpened into a chorus of fragmented pleas and half-formed names, a sound that seemed to originate from just beneath the water's surface. Then the lake began to give up its dead. Pale, shimmering forms rose from the leaden water, not as solid figures, but as shifting patches of luminescence that held the vague shape of people. Their movements were wrong, a slow, drifting pantomime of human activity, replayed on a loop. Terror screamed at Alara to run, to abandon her equipment, and flee into the woods. Instead, her training took over. Her hands trembled violently as she raised her camera, the click of the shutter, an obscenely loud and mundane sound in the supernatural stillness. She documented them, forcing herself to observe through the lens as one of the apparitions drifted toward the shore. It stopped at the water's edge, its form coalescing into a more defined, though still translucent, human shape. Then it did something that froze the blood in her veins. It mirrored her. As she adjusted her stance, the figure shifted its weight. When she lowered the camera slightly, its head tilted in perfect, eerie unison. For a single, heart-stopping moment, their eyes seemed to meet, and a wave of profound, inexplicable sadness washed over her, a grief that felt both alien and intimately familiar. Then the figure dissolved back into the mist, leaving behind only a profound silence and a deep, chilling sense of recognition. She did not know who or what she had just seen, but a part of her felt she should. It was in the frantic aftermath that she discovered the consequence of that connection. Her memory card, which should have been filled with evidence, was corrupted. The files were glitched and fragmented, showing only brief, distorted flashes of the pale light before dissolving into digital static. The lake was not just hiding its secrets, it was actively erasing them. This defiance, this attempt to steal her proof, ignited a stubborn resolve beneath her fear. She would not let this place win. Scrambling to her pack, she retrieved a sterile sample vial and waded into the shockingly cold water, filling it to the brim. It was a tangible piece of the lake, a physical proof she could analyze, something it could not so easily corrupt. But as she retreated to her camp, a new, more insidious fear took root. The details of the encounter were already blurring in her mind. The specific shape of the figure's face, the exact sound of its whisper, they were slipping away like sand through her fingers. The entities were not just echoes of lost memories, they were feeding on them, and her own were now on the menu. This realization sent her stumbling back through the dark woods toward her rented cabin, the sensation of being followed a palpable pressure between her shoulder blades. The pale forms were no longer confined to the shoreline. They drifted at the edge of the tree line, their silent observation more threatening than any pursuit. Barricading herself inside, her first action was to attempt data recovery on the damaged footage. The software churned for what felt like an eternity, piecing together broken digital scraps. And then it appeared on her screen, a single, clear frame snatched from the corruption. It was a close-up, a face. It was weathered and old, with eyes that held a deep, weary sorrow. It was the face of the entity that had mirrored her, and with a jolt that stole her breath, Alara realized she knew it. It was the face of her grandfather, from a photograph taken decades before she was even born. A man whose frantic journals had led her here. A man whose own memories were now part of the chorus beneath the lake. That face on her screen was her grandfather, but it was also the face of a stranger. Elara spent the next morning in a frantic cross-reference, laying out his old photographs beside the corrupted image. The weathered features matched perfectly, but the story they told was incomplete. She dug deeper into the journals, past his personal entries, into the clipped newspaper articles he had tucked away. One brief, yellowed clipping mentioned a local fisherman, a friend of her grandfather's, who had vanished on the lake decades ago during a sudden squall. His name was Alistair. The face from the water was his. This was no longer just a ghost story. It was a specific, unresolved tragedy. Armed with a name and a burning need for context, she sought out his last surviving relative, an elderly sister named Mave, who lived in a small, isolated cottage on the far side of the woods. Mave's initial reaction was a door closed firmly in her face. It was only when Alara mentioned her grandfather's name, when she spoke of the frantic journals and the face in the water, that the door cracked open. The old woman's eyes, clouded with age and a deep, old sorrow, studied her with a mix of fear and a flicker of desperate hope. Inside, over a cup of untouched tea, Mave's voice was a fragile thread of sound as she shared fragments of a story worn smooth by time. She did not speak of ghosts or monsters. She spoke of the lake's hunger. It did not just take bodies, she explained. It took memories. After Alistair vanished, people's recollections of him began to fade at an unnatural rate. His favorite song, the sound of his laugh, even the precise color of his eyes, it all grew blurry and distant, as if the lake was pulling the threads of him back into its depths, stitch by stitch. Her own memories were now thin and full of holes, a patchwork quilt with most of the squares missing. Listening to Mave, Elara felt a cold dread settle in her own mind. Were the gaps in her own recollection of that night on the shore merely shock, or was the erosion already beginning? Should she trust the solid ground of her own perception, or the haunting, fragmented tales of this grieving old woman? This internal conflict was sharpened by an external threat. As she left Mave's cottage, she noticed a man, the same reclusive farmer who had first warned her away, watching from the edge of the tree line. He did not speak, but his stance was a clear, silent warning to leave, and his presence felt far more menacing than before. The community's protective silence was hardening into active opposition. Yet, looking at Mave's profound loneliness, at the empty space where a brother should have been, Alara's academic curiosity transformed into a deep, empathetic resolve. When Mave, her voice trembling, asked for help recovering a simple silver locket, a birthday gift she believed Alistair had been bringing to her the day he disappeared, Alara agreed without hesitation. It was no longer about proof for a thesis. It was about restoring a piece of a stolen past. The emotional weight of this promise changed everything. That night, the lake's voices did not just whisper from the shore, they flooded her dreams. They were a chaotic symphony of lost moments and forgotten names, and within the din, she felt her own determination, her very purpose for being at the lake, begin to feel thin and insubstantial. Waking in a cold sweat, she had to clutch her grandfather's journal to her chest, physically anchoring herself to her mission. The stakes were no longer about discovery, but about survival of the self. Quietly, methodically, she began gathering simple diving gear, a wetsuit, and an underwater flashlight, preparing to search the lakebed for a lost piece of silver. She focused on the practical task, believing her plan was her own secret. But out on the leaden water, the air grew still and heavy, as if the lake itself was holding its breath, already aware of the intrusion she was about to attempt. The water was a shock of absolute cold, clamping around her like a fist. Alara pushed downward, her underwater flashlight cutting a frail beam through the murky gloom. Every kick was a battle against an unseen current that seemed to pull at her with a will of its own. And the whispers were not just in her headphones now, they were in the water itself, a disorienting chorus of echoes that bounced off the rocky lakebed, making it impossible to tell which direction was up or down. Her focus narrowed to the task, a desperate anchor in the sensory chaos. She was searching for a specific rock formation her grandfather had sketched in the margins of his journal, a place he had marked with a frantic question mark. And there it was, a dark, jagged arch looming out of the darkness. Tucked within its shadow, caught on a skeletal branch, was a small, tarnished gleam of silver. Mave's locket. Her heart surged and she swam for it, her movements clumsy with cold and adrenaline. But as her fingers closed around the cold metal, her fin brushed against something else, a cluster of smooth, dark stones nestled in the sediment. They were not natural. Each one was carved with intricate, spiraling symbols that began to pulse with a soft, internal light the moment she disturbed them. The hum she had felt on the shore became a physical vibration in the water, a deep, resonant thrum that made her teeth ache. The whispers swelled into a deafening roar inside her skull, a cacophony of 1,000 lost moments, crashing over her at once. She felt the sharp sting of a forgotten scraped knee, the warmth of a sunbeam in a room that no longer existed, the crushing grief of a loss she had never personally known. These were not her memories, they were the lake's stolen collection, and it was flooding her mind in a frantic attempt to drown her. The current tightened around her legs like a cold, watery rope, threatening to drag her deeper into the dark. Her air was running low, her thoughts fragmenting under the psychic assault, but the weight of the locket in her hand, the promise she had made to a lonely old woman, became her lifeline. She focused on that single, tangible goal, fighting back against the tide of forgotten lives. In a split-second decision, driven by a hunger for answers that outweighed all caution, she did not just take the locket. She snatched one of the glowing stones from the nest, stuffing both treasures into the mesh bag at her hip. It was a direct provocation, a theft from the lake's own hoard. The retaliation was immediate and absolute. A final, crushing wave of pressure, both mental and physical, slammed into her. Then nothing, a perfect, terrifying blank. She broke the surface gasping, her lungs burning, clawing her way back onto the muddy shore. She was safe, but her mind was a void. She had no memory of pushing off from the bottom, no memory of the agonizing swim upward, no memory of escaping the current's grip. The final moments of her dive were simply gone, erased as cleanly as a corrupted file. Shivering uncontrollably, she crawled away from the water's edge and emptied her bag. The silver locket and the softly glowing stone tumbled onto the grass, solid and real, proof. But as she reached for her journal to document the impossible retrieval, her blood ran colder than the lake water. The entries she had written just that morning, detailing her dive plan and her reasons for going, were already fading. The ink was blurring, the words becoming indistinct smudges on the page, as if the memory of the decision itself was being pulled back into the depths. She was holding the evidence in her hands, yet the story behind it was already starting to dissolve. The silver locket felt like an anchor to reality, but the fading ink in her journal was a terrifying countdown. Elara knew she needed answers faster than the lake could steal them. The townsfolk were a wall of silence, but her grandfather's notes mentioned one other person, a man named Alistair, who was not the drowned fisherman, but a living archivist, a collector of things the world had chosen to forget. His shop was tucked away in a narrow alley, a place that seemed to repel attention. The bell above the door chimed a thin, lonely sound as she entered a space-crammed floor to ceiling with forgotten objects, each one a silent testament to a lost memory. Alistair himself was a gaunt, wary man whose eyes held the same deep caution she had seen in Mave. He was not initially welcoming. Her presence, he said, was a disturbance. The lake was a delicate and dangerous ecosystem, a living entity that fed on remembrance to sustain its own strange existence. Every question she asked, every recording she made, was like dropping a stone into its waters, creating ripples that accelerated the very process of forgetting she was trying to stop. She was not an investigator, she was a catalyst. His distrust was a palpable force in the cramped room, and Alara felt her own fears reflected in his words. Could she trust her own mind when the foundation of her memories was being steadily washed away? The conflict was no longer just external, it was a war for her own identity. Yet, seeing the depth of his knowledge, she made a critical decision. She would not just ask for his help, she would prove her resolve. She showed him the glowing stone. The moment he saw its pulsing, carved surface, his entire demeanor shifted from distrust to a kind of horrified awe. This was not just another artifact, it was a piece of the lake's own heart. With a furtive glance at the windows, he finally relented, leading her to a back room protected by a heavy door. Inside was his protected collection, a carefully curated archive of the lake's hunger. There were water-stained diaries with blank pages, photographs where faces had faded into blurry smudges, and trinkets that hummed with a familiar, low energy. It was a museum of absences. As they pored over the documents, shadows began to gather outside the shop, not the pale forms from the lake, but the living, hostile figures of the townspeople who saw her as a threat to their fragile peace. The pressure was building from all sides. Knowing time was short, Alara worked with a frantic urgency. She could not risk taking the original texts, so she began to meticulously copy key passages by hand, her pen scratching rapidly in the quiet room. She sketched the intricate symbols from the glowing stone, creating a duplicate record on fresh, untainted paper. It was a deliberate act of defiance, an attempt to create a backup for a reality that was actively deleting itself. Her determination to create a permanent record, even as her own memories frayed, was the one thing the lake could not easily corrupt. The stakes escalated violently the very next morning. They found Alistair's shop vandalized, the windows smashed, and the door splintered. No items were stolen. The message was clear and personal. It was a warning to stop, a threat of violence against anyone who aided her quest. The community's silent dread had curdled into active malice. This act of intimidation, however, forged a reluctant alliance. Seeing the lengths to which the opposition would go, Alistair shared his final piece of decoded text. Together, they deciphered that the stone was not merely an artifact, it was a key. Its symbols corresponded to a specific ritual, a way to open a channel of communication with the chorus of voices rather than just being drowned by them. The text spoke of a sacred site, a clearing on the northern shore where the veil was thin, a place where a confrontation with the lake's core consciousness might be possible. The path forward was now terrifyingly clear. The Glade of Echoes was a basin of unnatural silence, a perfect circle of moss and stone where even the wind seemed to die. Elara's hands trembled as she arranged the ritual items from Alistair's archive, placing the glowing stone at the center of a spiral of etched symbols she had drawn in the soft earth. She took a final, steadying breath and spoke the words of opening, her voice a fragile thread in the oppressive quiet. For a moment, nothing happened. Then the air itself began to shimmer, and the whispers returned, not as a distant chorus, but as a torrential downpour of sound directly into her mind. She was inundated with flashes of other lives, a child's birthday party, a fisherman's last catch, a shared joke between lovers. These were the echoes of the lost townspeople, their memories preserved in this painful, fragmented state. But the lake's guardian was not far behind. A formless, shifting darkness began to coalesce at the edge of the glade, a void that drank the light and sound from the air, a presence of pure, predatory hunger focused entirely on her. The internal conflict was immediate and agonizing. She could feel the desperate yearning in the spectral voices, a plea for recognition, for someone to bear witness to their stolen lives. Yet the Guardian's approach was a physical weight, a cold that promised not death, but oblivion. It wanted to unmake her, to add her story to the chorus, and leave her an empty shell. In a moment of terrifying clarity, she understood that the voices would not trust her unless she offered something real. So she made a choice. Closing her eyes, she focused on her most vivid, cherished memory, the warmth of her grandfather's study, the smell of old books, and the sound of his voice reading to her as a child. She did not just remember it, she offered it, holding the memory out in her mind like a gift. A wave of profound cold washed over her as the memory was taken, its colors dimming in her mind, becoming a story she knew rather than a moment she had lived. But the gamble worked. The chaotic tide of voices stilled for a moment, and a single, clear image formed in the air before her, a vision of the town's founder standing on this very shore, performing the first ritual that had bound the lake's consciousness, creating this guardian to contain a sorrow he could not control. The entity, however, had tasted her memory and now wanted the rest. It surged forward, growing more solid and menacing, its hunger a palpable force that began to leach the very details from the glade itself, the color of the moss fading, the shapes of the stones blurring. The stakes were no longer just about lost souls, she realized with dawning horror. The lake's hunger was spreading, an amnesia that was creeping toward the town, threatening to erase every story, every history, until nothing remained but the silent, gray water and the insatiable void that guarded it. She broke from the glade in a blind run, the guardian's cold breath on her neck, her mind reeling with the new, terrible knowledge. Appeasing this entity was impossible. It was a wound that could only consume. To save the town, she would have to find a way to sever the binding itself. Alara found Mave sitting in her garden, her hands idle in her lap. The moment the old woman saw the tarnished silver locket, a sound escaped her, a raw mix of a sob and a gasp. She clutched it to her chest, her knuckles white, and the dam of her silence finally broke. Her confession was a torrent of long-suppressed grief. She told Alara how the pain of losing Alistair had been an unending, physical agony. The lake offered a way out, a quiet bargain. One day, standing on the shore, she had simply wished to forget. She had actively given her most painful memories of him to the water, and the relief had been immediate, a numbness that was better than the hurt. It was a pact, she whispered, a trade. The town was not just a victim of the lake, it was complicit. Its residents, over generations, had willingly fed it their sorrows to make their own lives bearable. The implications settled over Elara like a cold fog. The lake was not a monster preying on the innocent. It was a symbiotic predator, sustained by voluntary sacrifices of memory. But as Mave spoke, as she held the locket and allowed herself to remember her brother's smile, a remarkable thing happened. The perpetual haze of confusion in her eyes began to lift. Her recollections grew sharper, more detailed. The simple act of reclaiming a single, tangible piece of her past was weakening the lake's hold on her mind. This was the path to resistance, not through force, but through the courageous act of remembering. Yet the clarity came with a price. As Mave's memories solidified, so did her grief. The sorrow that returned was fresh and acute, and Alara was torn. Was it right to encourage others to reopen such deep wounds? Would it be a kindness to let people live in their peaceful, curated numbness? Or was the truth, no matter how painful, the only path to true freedom? Her internal debate was cut short by the angry glares from a group of locals who had gathered at the edge of Mave's property. They did not see Mave's returning lucidity as a victory. They saw it as a dangerous unraveling, and they blamed Alara for pulling the thread. Faced with this moral crossroad, Alara made her choice. She would not become another keeper of the lake's terrible secret. She took out her journal and began to document Mave's story with meticulous care, writing down every detail of her confession and the visible change in her. This was no longer just folklore. It was a case study in how to fight back. She would reveal the truth, even if it caused short-term pain, because the alternative was an eternity of slow, willing erosion. That night, the lake's agitation was a physical force in the air. The whispers that crept from the shore were no longer a chaotic chorus. They were focused, personal. They wove through the trees and under her cabin door, forming two chillingly clear words: Alara Vance. The entity knew her name. It had tasted her memory, and now it was calling for her. Armed with the profound understanding that the lake's power was rooted in these bargains of forgetfulness, she knew what she had to do. Appealing to the guardian was useless. To break the cycle, she had to go to the source, to the very heart where all these stolen memories were stored. She would have to dive back into the darkness, this time heading straight for the nest of glowing stones. The lake was a mirror of polished obsidian under the moonless sky. Elara stood on the precipice of the old wooden dock, the protective charms from Alistair's archive clutched in one hand, his hand-drawn maps in the other. They felt like fragile shields against the abyss she was about to enter. This was not a dive for a locket. This was a dive into the very heart of the forgetting. With a final, steadying breath that did nothing to calm the tremor in her limbs, she stepped off the edge and let the darkness take her. The descent was a journey into a different world, a place where light and memory lost all meaning. The water was colder than before, a cold that seeped directly into her soul. Her flashlight beam seemed to shrink, swallowed by a murk that was more than just sediment. It was a tangible gloom, thick with the ghosts of 10,000 yesterdays. The whispers were a physical pressure against her eardrums, a cacophony of stolen laughter and unshed tears. She felt her own past begin to waver. The face of her first teacher flickered in her mind, then blurred into a featureless smudge. The melody of a song she loved dissolved into static. Each lost detail was a small death, a piece of her identity being erased in real time. The terror was paralyzing. Who would she be if she made it back to the surface? Would there be anything left of Alara Vance at all? Then her light found the cavern. It opened beneath her, a vast subterranean cathedral, and within it, the lake's horde swirled. Thousands of luminous orbs, each one a captured memory, drifted in a slow, beautiful, and heartbreaking ballet. They pulsed with soft light, showing fleeting images of birthday cakes, holding hands, sunsets on this very lake from a century ago. This was not a monster's lair. It was a library of lost souls, a gorgeous and tragic archive of everything the town had tried to forget. The Guardian rose from the center of the swirling lights. It was the formless darkness from the Glade, but here, in its own domain, it was immense. It had no face, no limbs, only a swirling, silent hunger that blotted out the orbs behind it. It moved to block her path to the nest of glowing stones at the cavern's very center, the source of the pulsing energy. The conflict was absolute. Every instinct screamed at her to fight, to flail, to flee. But force was a language this entity did not speak. It fed on resistance, on fear, on the very energy of conflict. To fight was to be consumed. In that moment of absolute terror, as another cherished memory, the feeling of her mother's hug threatened to slip away. She understood. The Guardian was not evil. It was a creation of sorrow, a wound given form, and it knew only one function: to make the pain stop. And so, as the entity loomed over her, she made a choice that defied every survival instinct. She stopped fighting. Instead of clinging to her memories, she chose to give one away. She closed her eyes and did not offer a memory of loss or fear. She offered one of pure, unadulterated joy. She recalled a summer afternoon from her childhood, running through a sprinkler in her grandparents' backyard, the sun warm on her skin, the smell of cut grass thick in the air, her own laughter ringing in her ears, utterly free and safe. She held that memory out not as a shield, but as a gift. The effect was instantaneous and profound. The advancing darkness halted. The crushing pressure in her mind eased. The Guardian, this entity that had known only grief for generations, seemed to hesitate, captivated by a sensation it had never been fed. The simple, radiant joy was a dissonant note in its symphony of sorrow, a flavor so foreign it momentarily confused its predatory purpose. The swirling darkness softened at its edges, and for a single, crucial second, its attention was completely absorbed by the offered light. The path to the heart of the lake was open. Her fingers closed around the central orb, and the world dissolved into pure light. The cavern, the Guardian, the cold water, all of it vanished, replaced by an overwhelming flood of consciousness. This was the lake's core, not a monster, but a vast, ancient recorder. She saw its origin, a natural, benevolent force that had simply absorbed the emotional echoes of the land, a silent witness to joy and sorrow alike. But then she witnessed the turning point, the moment human grief became too much to bear. A founder, drowning in loss after a great tragedy, had not just wished to forget, he had screamed it into the water, his raw, desperate pain twisting the lake's passive nature into an active hunger. The townspeople who followed, offering their own sorrows in secret bargains, had only deepened the scar, creating the predatory guardian as a reflection of their own desire to escape. Elara understood then that the lake was a mirror, and the town was terrified of its own reflection. Her own fear was washed away by a wave of profound empathy. How could she destroy this entity when it was born from a pain she now felt as her own? Its existence was a tragedy, not an evil. A simple destruction would be another act of violence, another thing forgotten. The conflict was no longer about defeating the lake, but about healing the wound that created it. She had to offer it a different purpose. Focusing all her will, she did not demand the memories be released. Instead, she shared them. She poured her grandfather's decades of research into the core, the stories of Alistair and Mave, the hidden history of the town's pacts. She showed the core the value of these remembered lives, not as food for its hunger, but as stories worthy of being known. She presented a new bargain, a radical shift in the ancient pact. Let the memories return to the people, not as a painful burden, but as a legacy to be honored. Let the town finally face what it had tried to bury. And for this to work, for the lake to trust this new way, she offered herself as the conduit. She would be the bridge, the first person to willingly hold both the lake's consciousness and the town's returning history inside her mind. The risk was absolute. To merge with the core, even temporarily, was to risk being subsumed entirely, her identity scattered into the chorus forever. But the alternative was the slow death of everything that made the town and its people who they were. As the pact was sealed, a searing current of energy surged through her. It was not the cold of oblivion, but the brilliant, painful warmth of 1,000 lives returning home. She felt the lake's agony begin to ease, its predatory hunger receding as its original, preservative nature reasserted itself. Deep within the cavern, the swirling orbs of light brightened, their gentle pulses synchronizing into a single, radiant heartbeat. Then they began to rise. A torrent of luminous memories streamed upward around her, a reverse waterfall of forgotten moments rushing toward the distant, shimmering surface. She broke the surface as the first rays of dawn touched the water, gasping not just for air, but for the solidity of her own mind. The world rushed back in with a stunning, painful clarity. The cold was a physical agony, but inside, her thoughts were her own again, sharp and defined against the fading echo of the chorus. Stumbling onto the shore, she saw the lake had fallen perfectly still, its surface a flawless mirror of the soft pink and gold sky, the whispers replaced by an immense, peaceful silence. Her body trembled with exhaustion, but a new energy propelled her toward the town. The memories were not just free, they were returning home. She found the first townspeople already gathering in the square, not in anger, but in a dazed, quiet confusion. An elderly man was weeping, not from sorrow, but because he had just remembered his daughter's wedding day with a vividness he had not known in decades. A woman clutched the arm of a neighbor she had barely spoken to, her eyes wide with the sudden, returned knowledge that they had been childhood best friends. The air itself seemed to shimmer with the weight of 1,000 rediscovered stories. Alara moved among them, no longer an outsider to be feared, but a steady presence in the swirling emotional storm. She did not lead or direct, she simply helped. She guided a disoriented old woman to a bench. She fetched water for a man overcome by the sudden grief of a loss he had paid the lake to take away. She witnessed both profound joy and raw, reopened pain, understanding that healing this community meant honoring all of it, the beautiful and the brutal. Not every returned memory was a gift. She saw a husband and wife standing feet apart, the air between them thick with a recalled betrayal that their peaceful amnesia had buried. She watched as a family confronted the long-forgotten truth of a disputed inheritance, their quiet resentment flaring into open argument. The town's hard-won peace, bought with the currency of forgetting, was shattered. Some people looked at her with gratitude, their eyes clear for the first time in years. Others looked at her with a fresh, bitter resentment. She had given them back their pain, along with their joy, and they were not sure they wanted it. Faced with this turmoil, Alara made her choice. She would not leave. Her quest for a story was over, but her responsibility to the people in it had just begun. She found an abandoned storeroom near the square and began cleaning it out, her movements purposeful. This would not be a hidden archive like Alistair's, a fortress against the forgetting. This would be a public library of remembrance, a place where every story, every returned memory, could be written down, recorded, and shared. She invited people to come and tell their tales, to give their pain and their happiness a permanent home on the page. The threat of the hungry depths was gone, the lake now a placid, reflective sheet of water, but the new challenge was just as daunting, rebuilding a community's identity from the recovered fragments of its past. The work would be slow, and some wounds might never fully close, but for the first time, the people of the town were facing their history with open eyes, ready to remember together. Seasons turned, and the town learned the language of its own past. Alara watched from the window of the small library, now filled with the quiet murmur of voices, sharing stories instead of the oppressive silence of secrets kept. The work was slow, often painful, as the community pieced itself back together, not from forgetting, but from remembering. She saw how a shared history, even one laced with sorrow, could build a stronger foundation than any piece bought with oblivion. Her own purpose had crystallized in that process. She was no longer just a folklorist collecting tales. She had become a guardian, a keeper of the fragile bridge between the past and the present. The lake itself was transformed. On calm days, its surface was a perfect mirror, reflecting not just the sky, but the town itself, a symbol of its new willingness to look upon its own reflection without fear. The deep waters still held their mysteries, but they no longer defied memory. They cradled it, their stillness a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. Elara's own sacrifice, the memories she had willingly given, left permanent gaps in her personal history, but she found she did not miss them. They were the price of a deeper understanding, a trade for a connection to something far larger than herself. Her journey had begun with a question about strange whispers, but it ended with a profound answer about the nature of our own stories. Every community, every family, Every individual carries their own version of Lake Aethel, a depth of forgotten joys and buried pains. The true mystery is not what lies hidden in those waters, but whether we possess the courage to look into them, to reclaim the voices that whisper from our own past. The world is full of such places, silent and waiting, their strange tales lingering just beneath the surface of the everyday, hoping for someone who dares to listen.